So today I want you to think about your yarn and your pattern coming together in a similar way that we would put ingredients together in cooking. I have some notes here, so I'll be looking down occasionally. Um, but diff there's a similarity in finding the right yarn to go with the right pattern or the right pattern to go with the right yarn. And I want to talk about that today. And I want to talk about that from a perspective that might sound a little bit crazy from a person who sells yarn for a living. But I want to talk to you about shopping for your yarn in your yarn stash. If you're new here, I'm Suzi Quillen. I'm the Empress of Yarn here at Perfectly Knotty, and I am so glad that you're here. I would love it if you would subscribe to this YouTube channel and click the notification bell so that you get, notified whenever I have a new video. So some of the things that we're going to talk about in this is going to be understanding the different aspects and qualities and intrinsic structures of different types of yarn. Someone asked me recently, well, if a pattern calls for a DK weight yarn, can't I use just any DK weight yarn? And the actual answer is no, not really. You need to examine what's happening with that pattern and why it is calling for that particular yarn or that type of yarn. Certain yarns have qualities that make them very relaxed and drapey, and they have a fluidity to them. And then other yarns have a lot more structure to them, and they're going to show stiff definition, or they're going to hold a shape very, very well. And we need to be aware of those qualities in addition to their size weight. And that's whether or not you're using the Craft Yarn Council yarn numbering system, or if you're using the more traditional associated sizing like fingering, sport weight, lace, worsted, that sort of thing, which is what I generally tend to follow. So just But one of the things I think that's really interesting and fabulous and amazing is much like learning to bring ingredients together in our food, learning to bring our pattern and our yarn together in our projects. It's going to give us victory and make us excited for what we're creating, or is perhaps going to frustrate us. So let's talk about some of that. Swatching is your key here. Now, you don't have to do crazy full-on swatching if you don't want to. There's nothing wrong with that, and I highly recommend it when you're making projects that need to fit a certain size and shape. Hats, sweaters, socks, that's really important. Or even if you are working on a collaborative group project and you're making, let's say, Afghan squares, and you need those squares to be a certain size. Knowing and understanding your gauge is going to help you achieve that correct size. But there are other things about swatching that are just playful and interesting and help you to begin like like dating that sweetheart of yours, getting to know them. You're going to spend some time with that yarn, with your knitting needles or your crochet hooks, and you're going to experiment. How does it move? Sometimes a yarn feels splitty, but sometimes that's happening because the yarn does not have a strong twist to it, and your needle or your hook isn't sliding into the yarn in between the loops of the yarn in a nice way. Sometimes simply changing your tool can change how that yarn is reacting. Combining a slippery yarn with a needle that's metal, which is slippery, is going to increase the risk of you dropping stitches. But also, using a wood needle that is grippy, most wood needles are fairly what we would consider grippy, with a yarn that is grippy, like a wool or an alpaca, an animal fiber yarn. Those tend to be have a more grip. The fibers stick together and you're going to find yourself fighting with it more. So don't blame the yarn. Don't blame the needles. Blame the combination. Okay. So experiment with that. See what those different things feel like. Also, pay some attention to the construction of the yarn. Some yarns have a very tight twist, and those yarns work very well for giving really crisp and well-defined stitch definition. And worked with a little bit tighter tension, those yarns can also do a really great job of holding structure and shape for dimensional projects. Other yarns are more lightly twisted and they're going to relax a little bit more and have some more movement. And then there's the chainette yarns that are little tiny knitted tubes, something kind of like a shoelace. Those have a structure to them, but sometimes that structure can actually be almost flat and they will have definition, but they will not have loft. You also need to understand the actual fiber that your yarn is made out of. There is no right fiber. There is no wrong fiber. There's no better fiber. There's no worse fiber. There is no such thing. It has to do with what you're doing. There's a lot of people that consider themselves a yarn snob and therefore they only knit with sheep wool. But I really think that they limit themselves when they do that. And then there are those people that feel like all yarn is just too expensive and they only knit with worsted weight acrylic. And I think you just as much so limit yourself. Different yarns and different fiber types have different jobs to do. And that's all there is to that. But think about what the qualities of the different fibers are doing. Animal fibers, as a general rule, not an absolute, but they generally have a little bit of a halo and the strands of the fiber will stick to each other. And we sometimes will refer to that as felting. And they will bond together even inside your stitches. And then they will hold the shape of your finished project because each individual loop that's linked together is holding on to itself, not just by the process of the looping, but because the strands of the fiber are grabbing hold of each other as well. Those fibers also often have a much higher thermal value, so they're warmer. Plant fibers, on the other hand, tend to be more sleek. Even linen, which can have kind of a strandy look to it, but really in its function, even though those strands can get a little like wild, crazy hairs sometimes, they really are smooth in the sense that they don't have those little cells that cause them to lock and stick together. And so the projects that we make with them will relax. And when you know that, you can choose the right project for that. You can choose a project that has seams or certain types of stitches that bring some added structure so that it will hold its shape, or you're creating something with the knowing and intention of that it's going to relax and end up feeling bigger than it was before. These are all things that you can experiment with and learn about to expand your basic knowledge and understanding of the yarns in your stash. A really fun way to experiment with that is swatching. And as we noted, swatching so that you have things that fit is one method of swatching, but another method of swatching is just simply to practice and play with and get to know that yarn and how that yarn is working with a particular stitch, how it's working with the type of knitting needle or crochet hook that you're using. And you can do that simply by working up just little blocks before you make something to see if it's giving you the fabric that you like. Or even more, and then you can just unravel that. But even more fun is to take a basic pattern, particularly one where gauge is not as huge of an issue, and practice making that item multiple times using different yarns. And I'm going to show you an example of this. This is the crochet version of my easy lace triangle scarf or shawl. It's available on the website. I'll put the link in the show notes. This version of it, I made this one by holding two strands of yarn together that were actually structurally rather small. One was a very nubbly, textury cotton acrylic blend, and the other one was a rayon, almost like heavy thread. And I held them together and I worked it out. This gives my shawl a different texture, and it was really interesting to work with those. I did this version of the same pattern. This one is made with a yarn that unfortunately has been discontinued, but it's called a Luru, and it is a very structured yarn. The yarn is made by having a cotton core, very much like crochet thread, that has an acrylic fluff, which is the color that you see around it, and then that is held in place with a filament that wraps around that and holds it all together, and it gives it halo. It makes it fluffy, soft, squishy, a little bit squishy, but because this yarn, the actual physical structure of the yarn is fairly small, it makes a lightweight fabric that's actually very warm. Where this one is also a lightweight fabric, but it's not as warm because it's a cotton. And the acrylic that's in it isn't fluffy. And then another example of the same pattern is this version that I made by striping several different DK weight acrylic yarns together. And this made something that was squishier. And they're all lovely. They're all different. They're all interesting. And I was quite entertained by making all of them because all of the yarns play into the patterns in very, very different ways. And it allowed me to think about reading my stitch work because each of them have a different texture. So you have to look at your stitches differently. Let's see. So coming into thinking more about substitutions, it requires some thought and it requires some understanding of what your pattern is doing and what your yarn is doing. If your pattern is for a basket, and a basket generally wants to have structure, and it wants the sides want to stand up, and maybe it has handles, you want to choose a yarn that is going to respond to the structure. It has structure of its own. You also want a yarn that, in a lot of cases, you're going to be using a crochet hook or knitting needles that are slightly smaller than what that yarn might want. To help increase the tension and the structure that allows that basket to stand up. So again, playing with things, sampling things, trying different combinations, and just learning to look at a skein of yarn, look at the yarn and the way that it's twisted, look at the way that the fibers are interacting together, even just in the skein. It's going to tell you a lot. In a skein, are the fibers hanging out close to each other or are they sliding away from each other? Because if they're doing that in the skein, they are going to do that in your project as well. So look for those clues. So I want you to look at the stash that you have, and I want you to think about why you bought it. Maybe you have a whole bunch of skeins that are just one skein of this, that, and the other thing that you bought traveling. I have a whole bag of that. But maybe you bought enough to make something substantial and then you haven't gotten around to it. But now you don't want to make the thing that you thought you bought it for. So let's talk about how to look at your yarn stash from the perspective of taking a pile of yarn and figuring out what you're going to do with it. On Ravelry, there's a really great search function if you go into the advanced search and then you scroll down the menu on the left-hand side. As you scroll down, start choosing things. Are you going to knit something or are you going to crochet something? Come down a little bit further. Do you already have an idea of the type of item that you want to make? Maybe you think you want to make a shawl or a blanket, or maybe you think you want to make a sweater, or maybe you have no clue at all. So make any or none of the appropriate choices there. And then I want you to scroll down much further to the bottom. And I believe that those show up kind of in different orders, and I think you can move them around now. But look for the section where you get to talk about the yarn itself. In there are several different options. There is an option where you can actually type in the specific yarn that you have, the name, the brand name, and the product line for that. If you don't know what that is, or sometimes if it's a discontinued yarn, they don't show up in Ravelry. You can just categorize it by its yarn weight. Is it a DK weight? Is it a worsted weight? You can tell Ravelry approximately how many yards do you have of that yarn? And then you click search, and it is going to pull up a whole bunch of ideas of what you could make with 800 yards of this DK weight cotton yarn. And it'll show you all kinds of things that you could make. You can scroll through and maybe you find a pattern and maybe you don't. Maybe it just inspires you to go look in the stash of pattern books you've got on the shelf behind you. Because if you're like me, you have that too. So why am I telling you all of this as a person who sells patterns and yarns? Because I want you to love what you have. And I want you to not forget about the things that you have. So let's talk about some patterns again. Like I said, the easy lace triangle patterns are currently free on my website, both the crochet version and the knit version. And I want to challenge you to get those if you don't have them and utilize them. They're just absolutely wonderful and they're very, very versatile. You can scale up, you can scale down. And the nice thing with them is that you just go until you run out of yarn. So they're not as dependent upon a certain amount of yarn. And you can mix and match your yarns for striping, which is what I did with that one. Another example I want to show you about using the same pattern with different yarns is the Down the Rabbit Hole cowl. that I designed. It's a lovely tube. This one's done with llama lace, which has a little bit of halo. It has a lovely twist. It's soft and squishy and fuzzy, and I love it. And I wear it in the wintertime quite a lot. But it also is very different from its friend that I made using a camel silk blend. And this one has a little bit of a sheen, and you can see the stitches in a very different way than you can in the other one. And this one, when I wear it, drapes a little bit more gently around the neck. And I have some silk yarn that I'm going to try this again and make one. It's going to be gray, and I'm going to use silk. So those are some ideas that I have for you. I hope you'll try them. I hope that you will comment down below and let me know that you tried them. I also want to encourage you to head over to the website, look for those free patterns. The Down the Rabbit Hole is not a free pattern, but the Easy Lace Triangles is a free pattern at this time. So get it now, because that could change. If you have questions, I'd love to hear them. If you have tried some of these techniques, I'd love to hear about that too. Make sure you sign up for the email newsletter when you visit the website. And make sure while you're here on YouTube that you subscribe and that you click the notification bell. I appreciate you so much. Again, I'm Suzi Quillen. I'm the Empress of Yarn here at Perfectly Knotty, and I am on a mission to help you make your stitching experience even better with every stitch that you make. Thanks for joining me.